Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and welcome again to our 12th session of the Project Management Professional course. And by this session, we conclude the 4th week of our course, which means that we will have only 1 week remaining to finish this course. So as you see, days go by very quickly. So again, we're still discussing planning for the project. And again, you can use all the time, you can use the planning process group from the 6th edition of the pen book guide to help you visualize. And you know, in agile approaches, we like visualization, right? Visualization is a great tool because, you know, a picture can tell you more than 1,000 words, right? So basically, while planning, when we started planning, we covered the following. We covered planning for stakeholders by developing a stakeholder engagement plan. Then we planned for the project schedule, so we developed a scope management plan, and we developed a documentation of the requirements, and based on these requirements, we developed a scope statement, and then we broke down the scope into more manageable pieces and created the WBS, the work breakdown structure. And with this, we have a scope baseline consisting of the scope statement and the WBS and the WBS dictionary. And then we moved on to planning for the schedule. So we developed again a schedule management plan, and we defined the activities that we need to do in order to create the work packages listed in the WBS. And then we basically sequenced those activities in the proper order, and we estimated their durations. And by this, we developed the schedule. And of course, when approved, it will become the schedule baseline. And then we moved on to planning the resources of the project. So we developed a resource management plan indicating what resources and who resources do we need in the project, and what are the skills and how to develop them, how to acquire them, how to keep them motivated, how to reward them, how to train them, and so on. And we used also, we estimated also the activity resources to help us also develop this resource management plan. And this, of course, again, integrates with the activity durations. And then we moved on to planning for the cost and the budget of the project. So we developed a cost management plan. We estimated the costs of the activities, and we aggregated, of course, those costs, and then we added 2 types of contingencies. The contingency reserve and the management reserve. We developed 2 types of reserves or buffers, right? And then we moved on to planning for quality, and we developed a quality management plan indicating what are the quality metrics that we need to achieve in the project and in the product, and how to achieve them, and who will be responsible for quality assurance, quality control, and so on. So basically, we developed the quality management plan. And then we moved on and planned for communication in the project. So we developed a communication management plan indicating who should know what, when, and by which means. And then we moved on, or we started planning for the risks in the project. So we started by explaining first some basic concepts about risk management, including the definition of risk, the definition of risk tolerance, the definition of risk threshold, risk appetite, and so on. And then we discussed how to identify risks in the project. We indicated that risks can be threats as well as opportunities, and you need to plan for both. And as concluded, we will end up by a long, very long list of risks that we can identify in the project. But we cannot plan for all of them. We cannot analyze and plan all of them. So what we did is basically that we performed qualitative risk analysis to prioritize those risks, to focus on the most important risks. And we did this by either multiplying the level of probability of the risk by the level of probability of the, the level of impact, of the risk impact, or by using a matrix, again, which indicates the levels of probability and the levels of impact. And the result was a probability impact matrix indicating or categorizing the risks into red zones, yellow zones, green zones, probably orange zones, depending on how you want to design your probability impact matrix, right? So this is the last thing that we have discussed. Today we will continue on by performing, of course, quantitative risk analysis. We will explain what's the purpose of quantitative risk analysis and planning for risk responses. And by this we conclude planning for risks, and then we move on to the last subsidiary plan, which is the procurement management plan and planning for procurement. Okay, so let's get back to our presentation. Do you have any question, ladies and gentlemen? How are things? How's the review? How's your preparation for the exam? Have you started preparing for the exam? By the way, when we conclude basically the planning, as you know, we are just about to finish the course. So you can start from now on, you can start practicing exams. And we have included in the materials, I think I told you that before, we have included 2 books, which are Hildman and Rita. And those 2 books probably have more than 2,000 to 2,500 exam questions that you can practice. So I think it's a good idea if you can start practicing exams from from now on. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to our next subject, which is the quantitative risk analysis. Again, so basically we identified risks and we came up with a huge and a long list of risks. So we needed to prioritize those risks. We did this by doing a qualitative risk analysis, as I mentioned. And then this is the next step. Now we need to understand actually and assess the risk exposure of these risks. Basically, this will help me identify time and cost contingencies that I need to set for each individual risk. If you remember, when we developed the budget, as I explained a few minutes ago, we added a contingency reserve, right? But at that point, since we didn't have a risk register at that point, we added a high-level contingency reserve, if you remember, right? But now we are doing a thorough analysis and identification of risks. And now I have a thorough list of risks that we have identified. So basically now it's time to fine-tune the contingency reserve. And we can do this by quantifying risks, by trying to find out the numerical impact on time and cost, especially on time and cost, for the risks that we have identified. And by doing this now, we can fine-tune the contingency reserves that we added to the cost baseline, right, and to the cost budget. So this is the objective here of the quantitative risk analysis, which is to fine-tune the reserves that we need to add to the cost baseline and to the budget, right? And this as well will refine and enhance the prioritization of the risks. We have prioritized risks, right, by doing a qualitative risk analysis. But now this is a further step that will help us also prioritize this, because when we do a quantitative risk analysis and we find out, for instance, that a specific risk has a huge impact, for instance, on the cost or on the schedule, then this risk should have more priority over other risks. You agree with that? So basically, this is the objective, again, of the quantitative risk analysis, is to numerically analyze those risks. And by doing this, identify the cost and time contingencies and fine-tune them that should be included in the budget, and also enhance the prioritization and scoring of risks. Now, one word about the quantitative risk analysis, one important word about the quantitative risk analysis that you should know, that sometimes it shows up in the exam. Quantitative risk analysis, as we will see later on, is expensive to do. It takes time. It needs probably special software to do it. It needs sometimes special hardware even to be able to host this complicated software. So it's expensive to do. It's something that is expensive to do. So basically, we don't regularly do it unless it's really important and unless the project is critical and vital. And then it's important to do the quantitative risk analysis. But for normal, projects that don't have that kind of criticality, you don't need actually to do it because it's expensive. It will add to the project budget as well, and probably to the project time as well. Okay, so for instance, think of, launching a rocket kind of a project. So if anything goes wrong, then the impact will be huge. So you need to make sure of, calculating all the probabilities and assumptions and considering all the possibilities. And you need to do that kind of quantitative risk analysis. But for, normal projects that the failure will not have such a huge impact, you won't probably do that kind of analysis. So basically, this is how we do the quantitative risk analysis. We usually do simulation for the project, and we try to simulate the project using, again, special softwares probably that simulate the project, the scenarios, the different possibilities, the different impact of different risks taking place either individually or combined together. Okay, so this simulation will generate probably hundreds of scenarios, different scenarios that we could face in the project. So what happens if we, for instance, added more resources or less resources? What happens if it rains or it doesn't rain? What happens if the prices materials go up or down? What happens if I added more skills or I took out more skills? What happens if there is political unrest in the country happens? You can simulate so many scenarios, and you can assume so many assumptions, and you want to find out what would happen if if these scenarios or any of them took place. So you end up with so many scenarios, and you might then consider the worst case and the best case, and the most likely case, what would happen, and so on. And this again would help you again prepare for what to do in those different cases, in those different scenarios. One of the simulations, probably also the well-known simulation, is the Monte Carlo simulation. And Monte Carlo is is a city. I think it's either in France or Monaco. I cannot recall now, but it's a city that is known for, for gambling clubs. Okay, so basically, since risks depend on different probabilities and calculating of different possibilities, so it's kind of gambling. At the end of the day, we are all taking risk again, so it's kind of gambling, and for that reason they called it Monte Carlo simulation. So basically what this simulation does is that it again iterates the scenario, the scenario of the project that you are taking into consideration. It iterates it many times with different inputs every time to see what would be the outputs. So again, what is the possibility, for instance, of the prices ranging from 100 to 300 US dollars for the, I don't know, for the petrol, for instance, okay? So what is the possibility of the 100, and what's the possibility of 101? What's the possibility of 102? So it takes the whole range from 100 to $300, the whole possible range of oil prices, and with their possibilities. So it ranges, the possibilities maybe would range between 50% to 90%. And it iterates this situation to see how the budget would look like. So basically it calculates the budget of the project when the oil prices range from 100 to 300, okay, with different possibilities. And it gives you this kind of, diagram, which we call again the beta diagram, which indicates for you the highest possibility. So probably the highest possibility of the budget is to be something here, something like around, I don't know, $1 million. But the budget can vary from, I don't know, 700 to $2 million. Okay, depending on the oil prices, that is, varying. So, by the way, you can do this Monte Carlo analysis. I think there's a plugin on Excel that you can use it to do Monte Carlo analysis using Excel. But it has also other softwares that you can use in order to generate this kind of simulation, by giving again the computer a range of values and a range of probabilities, and asking the software to calculate what is the most probable values and what is the least probable values, and so on. So basically the output would be something like that. The project budget will range from this value, from, I don't know, 100,000 US dollar to this value, might be $1 million, and with the highest probability being something at, I don't know, 400 US dollars, for instance. Okay, so this is the kind of the result you get when you do a Monte Carlo simulation. Okay. Another way of doing quantitative risk analysis that helps you actually in making decisions is a tool that we call a decision tree analysis. And to explain the decision tree analysis, I need to explain something else to you, something that we call the EMV, expected monetary value. What is the EMV, or the expected monetary value? Let's assume the following. Let's assume that you have two projects. Project A has a probability of success of, let's say, 40%. And if it succeeds, if the project is a success, then, for instance, we will end up making a profit of 100,000 US dollars. But there's, of course, a probability of failure. And let's assume that in this scenario, the probability of failure is 60%, since, of course, the probability of success is 40, then the probability of failure is 60%, so failure probability, 60%. And in this case, we will lose $30,000 US. This is project A. Another project, project B, has a success probability of 60%. And if it succeeds, then we will generate a revenue or a profit of, let's say, $80,000. It also, of course, has a failure probability of 40%. And if it failed, then we will lose, say, $40,000 US. Okay, let's assume that we have this scenario where you need to select between project A and project B, given this information. Project A have a success probability of 40% and a failure probability of 60%. If it succeeds, then we will make $100,000 US. If it fails, then we will lose $30,000 US. Project B have a success probability of 60%, which is obviously more than project A. If it succeeds, then we will make $80,000 US. If it fails with a probability of 40%, we will lose $40,000 US. And now the question is, do you prefer taking project A or project B? What do you think? What is the project that I should select? Project B. Why? We need to justify, right? Well, actually, we should base our decision on something solid, right? On kind of formula that we need to calculate. The formula that we need to use here to make the best decision is this, the expected monetary value. So basically, you need to calculate the expected monetary value for project A and the expected monetary value of project B and take the higher or the highest expected monetary value. Now, how do you calculate the expected monetary value for project A? Again, you have probability and you have monetary impact, right? So basically, this is what we will do. The expected monetary value for project A is calculated by probability of success, which is 40%, means 0.4, multiplied by the monetary impact of success, which is 100K, 100,000. Okay, but we have a probability of failure, so we might lose. Lose is minus, because we might lose. This is a failure probability. So 0.6, again, the probability of failure multiplied by the impact, the monetary impact of failure, which is 30K. Okay, so basically the way of thinking here is that there is a chance, there is a 40% chance that I will end up with 100K in my pocket. And there is a 60% chance that I will lose 30,000 US out of my pocket. So now take this with this and do the calculation. So here we have 40,000 minus 18, right? 40 minus 18 equals 22, right? If I'm not wrong. So this is the monetary value for project A, calculating the, the probability of failure and the probability of success and the probability of failure and the impact of each. Now let's do the same for project B. Expected monetary value for project B is calculated in the same manner. So basically you have probability of success then 0.6 multiplied by 80K minus 0.4 multiplied by 40K, which equals what? So we have 48 minus 16. 48 minus 16 equals how much? We grew too old. 48 minus 16, 32. Yes, exactly. So the expected monetary value of project B is 32,000 US dollars, which means that it has a higher expected value than project B. And this means that project B is preferred or should be selected. Okay. How do we calculate this? Now, using probably simulation, using expert judgment, going back to historical records, we try to figure out what's the probability of success and failure. Okay, but we need to, have an estimation of the probability and an estimation, of course, of the, money that we will make or that we will lose. So you can do that by, again, simulation, by Monte Carlo analysis, by just using an expert judgment. I might, if I want to do something quickly, then I might, meet different experts and ask them to estimate for me, even a high-level estimate or a rough estimate. What's the probability of success? What's the probability of failure? And what would be the impact? Okay. So this calculation is, again, is called the expected monetary value. Now, how do we use it? Again, in the tool that we call the decision tree analysis. Let's save this here. Okay, and we will clear all of this. So basically, the decision tree analysis uses the expected monetary value in order to take a decision. So for instance, let's say that you have a decision to make, which is, let's assume that you have a factory and you notice that the machines, the production machines in the factory are getting old and the number of defects is rising. Okay, so now you have a decision to make, which is, should we buy new machines or production line, or do a maintenance, maintain the production line? So what should we do? What's the best option? What's the best alternative? Buy a new production line or keep the old but do a maintenance? So basically, you have here two options that you need to consider. Okay, either buy or maintain, do maintenance. Okay, buy or maintain. Now, in order to take the best decision, I need again to calculate what? The expected monetary value. So I'll do that by doing the following. What's the cost? First of all, I need to ask, what's the cost of buying a new production line? Let's assume that if you want to buy a new production line, then for instance, you need 100K. So this is the cost of this decision, right? Of buying the new production line, okay? And when you buy a new production line, there are also different scenarios. For instance, the market might be very well, and the market share that we have will enable us, for instance, to generate 3,000, or let's say more, because we are buying new machines, then we can produce a large number of products. So let's say that we can sell up to 500,000. There's a probability that the market is excellent. And this probability, for instance, is, I don't know, 60% again. And that we will be able to make, with the new machines that we buy, we will be able to make 500K. But of course, there is another possibility that the market is low. This is a 40% possibility. Okay. And that with the new machines, we cannot make more than, let's say, 300K. Okay. The same analysis will be done here. So basically, you need here the cost of the maintenance. Of course, the cost of the maintenance is less than the cost of buying a new production line. So let's assume that the cost of maintenance is only 30K. And let's see the different scenarios as well, when you have a high market and when you have a low market. Again, with the same probabilities, right? You have a probability of having a high market, 60%. But since this is not a completely new machines or production line, you cannot make this amount, right? You might be able to make, for instance, with the old production line that you have, you might be able only to make 300K. And there's a possibility, 40%, that the market will be low. And in this case, you might end up only making 100K. Okay. So now, how do I take the decision? Again, I need to calculate the expected monetary value for buying a new production line and the expected monetary value for maintaining the old one, right? So basically, the expected monetary value of buy, how do we calculate it again? First, the high market, which is again 60%, 0.6, multiplied by the 500K that you might make if you have a good market, right? And then there's a probability of low market, 40%. So you will add that. Notice here that we are adding, not subtracting, because it's not a loss here. This is not losing. This is another, probability, which is 40% that you will make this sum. So basically, it's addition 0.440% multiplied by the 300K that you would make with the low market. Okay. Now, of course, you need to what? To subtract from that what? The cost of buying the new production line. We need to pay 100K to buy the new production line, right? So how much now is the expected monetary value for buying? 300 plus 120. So it means 420, 320, right? If I'm not wrong, 320K. This is the expected monetary value of the buying decision. The same analysis, Y minus 52. No, here you have 300 plus again 120, right? So 420 minus 100, 320. I think it's okay. It's correct, right? For maintenance, you have again 0.6 multiplied by 300K plus in the low market 0.4 multiplied by 100K minus the cost of maintenance, which is 30K. This equals what? So you have here 180 plus 40, so 220 equals, I think, if I'm not wrong, 190K. Review the calculations. Hopefully I didn't do something wrong, okay? So basically this is the expected monetary value of buying a new production line, 320K. And this is the expected monetary value of doing a maintenance to the old production line, 180K. So what's the best option here? Do we buy or maintain? No, the best option is to buy a new production line because of this calculation. Okay, we call this analysis the decision tree analysis. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, any question about the decision tree analysis and the expected monetary value? So, for instance, in this scenario, you might consider different vendors and what's the best case and worst case for the vendor, and again do the same calculations and end up, choosing the right vendor to work with. This is the cost of each vendor, again, the cost of selecting each vendor. Okay, again, this is a kind of quantitative risk analysis. Any questions so far? Great. So by this, we conclude the quantitative risk analysis. Again, the objective was to fine-tune the reserves that I need to allocate for my project in case of different risks taking place in the project. Let's move on now to the final step in planning for risks, which is to plan for risk responses. So after you have identified all the possible risks and prioritized them and calculated the numerical exposure of them, you need to plan for the responses. What are the options that we have in order to deal with those risks? And again, you need to develop options for both, for opportunities and for threats as well, okay? Of course, you will not plan for risks with low priority, as we explained earlier. You need to address those by priority that we have indicated, right? So basically, you start planning for responses for risks with the highest priorities, and then you move to the lower priorities and so on, okay? Now, each risk will be assigned a risk response plan and a person that we call the risk owner. Terminology again is important here. So who is the risk owner? The risk owner is the person that has been assigned to implement the response plan, the action that we have planned for if this risk takes place. If and when this risk occurs, then the risk owner should implement the action that we have planned, okay? There are, of course, certain response strategies that we will discuss later on. Another important thing that we need to think of is what happens if my plan did not work well. I planned a response. I planned an action. If a risk takes place, then this is what we will do. But what if plan A did not work well? What if the response plan did not work well? What should we do? Then probably we should also do a plan B, right? What we call a fallback plan. So what is a fallback plan? The fallback plan is a plan that we implement if the primary strategy is not effective. If we implemented the primary strategy that we have decided to implement and it was not effective or it was not adequate, then you have another plan that you can try to implement, which is the fallback plan. We call it the fallback plan, okay? Another thing that you need to consider is secondary risks. Those are risks that did not exist in the first place when we identified risks. They were not there, but when we decided that we will do some response plan, when we decided, for instance, that we will hand over this job to a contractor because the contractor can do this job better than us, then a new risk rises. What happened if the contractor did not do the job well? Okay, so this is a secondary risk because it was not there at the beginning. But when you decided to do a response plan, the response plan came with risks, with new risks. These new risks are called secondary risks, okay? And you might also want to identify them, analyze them, and plan for their responses, okay? So let's discuss now the different strategies that we can consider while planning for risk responses. Let's start by negative risks or threats. What are the strategies that we can use to respond to threats that might occur in the project? First of all, if the threat does not only affect your project, but other projects as well, or the organization as a whole, then you should do what? What's the strategy here? You should escalate this risk because it's not only affecting your project, it's affecting also other projects, probably in the program or in the portfolio or even the organization itself. So we should escalate it to the right level, probably to the program manager, to the portfolio manager, to the PMO, to the top management, whatever the right level is, okay? So the first strategy to consider is escalating. Okay, let's assume that it's not affecting other projects, it's only affecting your project. Then what are the possible strategies? Another possible strategy is avoid the risk completely by taking it out of the scope of the project. So basically avoid doing the job completely, eliminating the job from the scope because it's risky. We call this strategy avoidance. So avoiding the risk by not doing the job makes the possibility or the probability what? Makes it zero, right? So this is avoidance. So we will apologize. We will not do this work because it's too risky for us. It exceeds our risk tolerance. So we ask the client, for instance, to find someone else to do the job for them. And by this, we avoid taking this risk completely. And this is what avoidance is, right? Another possible strategy is transfer. So to transfer the risk to someone else, to a third party. So if this job is risky and we cannot avoid it because the client is insisting that either we take the whole project with the whole scope or we don't take the project completely, then we might consider an option like transferring the risk to or by subcontracting the job to someone who can do it better than us, to someone who's expert in this field, in this matter of job. So contracting or subcontracting, if we are the main contractors, then we will subcontract this job to a contractor who is better capable of doing this job with, you know, lower probability of doing mistakes, with lower risks impact, for instance. So this is a strategy of transfer the risk to other party. Insurance, for example, is or falls as well under this transfer strategy. So when you do insurance against fire, against, you know, catastrophic events, then you are transferring the risk to the insurance company. Okay, so you can avoid the risk completely by not doing the job at all, or you can transfer the risk by contracting someone to do it or by insuring it. Or other strategy, you can mitigate the risks by looking for ways to reduce probability or impact of the risk. So for instance, if there's a risk that we don't have the skills, the necessary skills to do the job, then what I can do is to acquire more skills, more talent, hire new people, for instance, increase my team skills pool. And by this, we are mitigating the risk of failure, because now we will include new experts in the team that have this know-how or technologies that they can use in order to make the job succeed. Okay, so this is mitigating by looking for ways to reduce probability or reduce impact of the risk. Okay, the last strategy is acceptance. And basically, whenever you have a risk, you have two options, right? Either to accept it or to avoid it, right? If you accept it without looking into options, how to deal with it, then this is what we call a negative or passive acceptance. So you accepted the risk, but you will not develop any plan or any contingency to deal with it. This is a passive acceptance. But if you accepted the risk and tried to develop options, for instance, transfer the risk, mitigate the risk, create a contingency plan, then this is a positive or active acceptance of the risk. Okay, is that clear? So basically, for any risk that you are facing in the project, for any threat, because here we are discussing threats, you have two options: either to avoid the threat completely or to accept it. If you decide to accept it, either you accept it without analyzing and developing options, just by accepting it and hoping it will not take place. Now, this is a passive acceptance. Or you accept it and you try to develop options to deal with it, like mitigating it or transferring it. Then this is a positive or active acceptance of the risk. Okay, is that clear? So these are the strategies that you can think of when you deal with negative risks or threats. Now let's see how or what are the strategies to deal with or to plan for opportunities, positive risks. Again, if the positive risk or if the opportunity affects not only the project, but other projects as well, or the organization as a whole, then we will escalate it, right, to the next level. But if it only affects our project, then what are the options? We can check if we can exploit this opportunity. So how can we exploit this opportunity if it takes place? For instance, there is an opportunity of the material prices to go down. Then how can we exploit this opportunity if it takes place? Someone would suggest that in this case, if material prices go down, let's go and buy the whole materials that we need for the project. And by this, we make a saving. We make an immediate saving, for instance. That's an example, okay? So exploit the opportunity if it takes place, if it happens. Another strategy is to try to find ways to enhance the probability of this opportunity taking place. So for instance, if there is an opportunity of, you know, a new law that mandates all organizations to take project management courses, okay? So this is an opportunity for us, right? Because we can give a lot of project management courses for all organizations. What we can do to enhance this opportunity is we try to, you know, push some decision makers and convince some decision makers that this is a very important thing that you need to do, and a very important and positive decision that you need to do, and this is a very important law, and it will enhance the performance of all organizations, and so on and so forth. So we push to enhance this opportunity, to increase the probability of this opportunity taking place, right? Another strategy is to share the opportunity. So let's assume that you have an opportunity, you have a project, for instance, that, you know, it's an opportunity. We can do a lot of, you know, we can make a lot of money if we assume this project, but we don't have enough fund for that. Then what we can do is try to share this opportunity. So we join forces. We might create a joint venture, for instance, with another party, where they provide the fund and we provide the skills or the know-how or the technology, and we work in this project together. So this is sharing the opportunity with other parties, right? And again, you have also the option of acceptance. And again, either you passively accept the opportunity, so you accept the opportunity and you do nothing about it, just hoping that it will take place, or you positively accept the opportunity and you try to find options by sharing it, by enhancing it, by exploiting it, okay? So these are the different strategies that you can use for either threats or opportunities planning, okay? Either ways, we need to develop contingency plans. Basically, what will we do? What are the actions that we will implement when the risk becomes a reality? Of course, if the risk becomes a reality, because we agreed that risks at the end of the day might take place, might not take place. So in case of this risk becomes a reality, what is the action plan? This is what we call the contingency plan, okay? And by preparing contingency plan, we don't need, for instance, time. If the risk takes place, we don't need time to prepare what we'll do and to take approvals and so on, because we have the plan ready and approved. So all what we need to do is to implement it. And again, who's responsible for implementing this plan? The risk owner, right? We call this person the risk owner. The risk owner is responsible for implementing the contingency plan when the risk takes place. Again, whether it's negative risk or positive risk, okay? And again, this might also include what? An additional plan, a fallback plan. So just in case the primary plan does not work well, we have an additional plan or plan B or a fallback plan that we can implement to make sure it succeeds, okay? Any question? Great. So here are some guidelines to determine and implement risk responses. Examine each identified risks and try to identify its causes, root causes, right? And by identifying the root causes, we can look for, you know, ways in order to look for, you know, completely eliminating it, for instance, if it's a threat, right? Choose the right response strategies that is effective for each risk. If you are unable to bring a risk rating between the, below the threshold, if the risk is above the threshold, then you cannot proceed with the project. You need an approval from the top management, right? Because it's above the threshold. Then you need to consult who? The sponsor, the project sponsor. Identify backup strategies, like we mentioned, the fallback plan. Determine the amounts of contingency reserves. So you need to do the quantitative risk analysis in order to fine-tune the contingency reserve for known risks and for unknown risks as well. to develop the management reserve. Consult with the risk management plan and incorporate the risk plans with all plans. Now that we have developed the risk response plans, we need to go back and probably update the scope, update the schedule, update the cost and budget, probably update also the, I don't know, resource management plan, because we will need additional resources to deal with those risks, and so on. So again, we will do a rolling wave plan, a new wave of planning, and update all the other plans that might be affected by the risk response plans that we have prepared. Okay, and by this we conclude the risk management plan. We develop a complete risk management plan indicating what is the risk strategy that we will be following and what is the methodology that we will use in order to identify the risks, to analyze the risks, and so on. What are the roles and responsibilities? I might assign certain roles and certain responsibilities for certain team members, like risk owners, as we mentioned. What is the fund that we will allocate as a contingency fund, and what is the time that we will allocate as a contingency time for the project? What are the risk categories, the red zone, the green zone, the yellow zone? What is the stakeholder appetite for different risks? Definition of probability and impact, and how many levels you want to use in the probability and impact matrix. What are the reporting formats? Who and how will be responsible, for instance, for tracking the documents, for reporting those, for identifying risks, and so on. Again, the management plan is the who and how of managing risks in this example. Okay, any question, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, let's have a look now at how agile approaches look at risks. First of all, agile approaches uses a golden rule, again, that indicates that the longer the project takes, the more risks it will face. This is a nice rule, right? Golden rule as well. The longer the project takes, the more risks it will face. And for this reason, in Agile, we again break down the project into iterations. So we cut the project time into iterations, and iterations will help me manage those risks and focus on those risks in every and each iteration. And iterations also will help minimize the work in process, and the work in process is considered risk. It's considered, as you know, one of the source of waste, and by this it's also considered a risk. And iteration, doing the job in iterations will reduce the WIP, and by this reduce the risk as well. The risk in Agile is always negative. We don't discuss opportunities in Agile. We don't discuss positive risks. The risks in Agile are always negative, and they are represented by anti-value. So basically, when you indicate a risk, or when you identify and analyze a risk in Agile, you try to evaluate this risk in negative terms. So if this risk takes place, the value will be decreased by, we will not be able to create, for instance, this function in the product, and the value will decrease by 10,000. So minus 10,000. The value of the risk is minus 10,000, for instance. Okay, so it's always expressed in anti-value. Okay, and risks should be confronted as early as possible, because of a very important principle as well, which is falling fast. This is a very important principle, right? Falling fast is falling safe. Failing fast or falling fast is falling safe or failing safe. Okay, so basically when we fail quickly in the project, then we will not lose a lot, right? Imagine if the project fails in the first week, what's the impact? The impact is minimum, right? Because we haven't started doing any job basically in the first week. But imagine if the project fails in the 10 months of the project, then what's the impact? The impact is very high, right? we spent a lot of money, we spent a lot of time, we allocated so many resources for the project. So when it fails late, it fails hard, right? So what we will do, this is the approach here in Agile, is we try to identify risks as soon as possible and prioritize them by their value, by their, again, negative value, and tackle them, attack them by priority. So just in case the project will fail because of, certain risk, then the failure will be fast and safe, okay? Failing fast is failing safe. Again, this is the principle, okay? Other thing is that risks are documented in a risk backlog. So we have a document in Agile approaches, just like the product backlog. We have another document for risks. We call it the risks backlog, containing all the identified risks that we have in the project and prioritized by the negative value, okay? And we try to tackle them or attack them as soon as possible, right? Starting from the highest priority risks. And to track them, we use this burn down chart. Now, the principle of burn down charts in Agile are commonly used is you have here the iterations. So you have iteration 1, iteration 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or sprints, of course, sprint 1, sprint 2. And you have here the number of risks in the risk backlog. So for instance, when we started iteration 1, we had 25 risks identified. When we ended sprint 1, we had only 18. So basically, this is a burn down. That's why it's going down, right? Now in sprint 2, we started with 18, but we identified probably additional 2 risks. So it increased a little bit, right, to 20. And then in sprint 3, we attacked, 10 risks, and we eliminated 10 risks. So we ended up with only 10 risks, and so on. So every sprint, we update this burn down chart to reflect how many risks do we still have in the risk backlog. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's how we track and manage risks in Agile. Okay, so let's take a break, 15 minutes, and practice some exam questions. Okay, any question? Great, so see you in 15 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, and after that we have concluded discussing planning for risks in the project. Let's have some practice on the exam questions. Question number 1. David is a project manager working for a prominent book publishing company. As the most senior project manager within this organization, he often gets paired with strong-willed project sponsors. During a recent project meeting, David's project sponsor began yelling in frustration at the project status, which was blocked because of a critical resource being out ill. In frustration, the sponsor began spewing profanities at David, questioning his ability to manage effectively. In response, David calmly assured the project sponsor that a contingency plan would be implemented and requested that they speak privately to address his frustration. David then excused the rest of the project team. What core value did David uphold during the meeting? Fairness, honesty, respect, responsibility. What's the value that David maintained in this meeting? David controlled himself, did not allow himself to respond defensively. So what is the value that David uphold here? Is it fairness? Is it honesty? Is it respect? Or is it responsibility? When you control yourself and continue respecting other people, although they did not respect you, then you what? Then yes, this is the value that you upheld. It's respect, not responsibility. If you go back to the explanation of those four and the examples of them, this is respect, right? Maintain an attitude of mutual respect. Okay. Okay, another question. A project manager is preparing to send 5 engineers to Japan to install a high security network. The engineers have never been outside of the US before. Prior to their travel, the project manager asked the Japan-based manager to give engineers an overview of their history, customs, and social norms. What's the project manager's motive to do that, to give this awareness training? To teach the engineers about the Japanese culture, to talk a breather after a hard day's work, to ensure the engineers understand how to interact abroad, to prevent cultural shock or culture shock. What do you think the right answer is? Why do we need to do this? Yes. It's actually, now again, C is not wrong. If you, for instance, answer C, it's not wrong. But what is more correct than that is to prevent a cultural shock. And part of preventing cultural shock is ensuring that the engineers understand how to interact. But it also includes other things like, understanding the different culture and the different customs, right? And respecting those as well. Yes, so this is the best answer. Okay. Another question. Your virtual project team consists of 12 people in the same building you're located in, plus 4 people from the West Coast office, 2 people from the Kansas City office, and 6 people from the London office. Your office works different hours from all other offices. Additionally, not all of the resources in your building are available at the same times during the day. 3 of those 12 team members work swing shift hours. Which of the following should you use to capture the availability information for these resources and potential future resources, as well as their capabilities and skills? Where do you find this information? Activity calendar, team roster, project calendar, resource calendar. Where do you find the information about the availability of the resources as well as their capabilities and skills? Yes, exactly. This is what you find in the resource calendar. Excellent. Okay, another question. A project manager is performing closure activities for the project and meets with the project sponsor to review the final report. The report reveals that the project budget is 90% consumed. The project sponsor expresses concern that there may be a risk of going over budget. How is the project manager likely to respond? Assure the project sponsor that the risk of going over budget is low. Agree with the project sponsor and begin risk mitigation activities. Email the project team to express disappointment in project spending. Take offense at the project sponsor's lack of trust and confidence. What do you think is the best option here? We are closing the project. The budget has been consumed by 90%. The sponsor is worried about going over budget. What is the best answer to this? Yes, since we are closing the project, this means that we probably finished executing all the activities. Closing the project is mostly about, the administrative work, the paperwork of closing the project. So what's the possibility of going over budget? It's very low, right? Excellent. Another question. You use a predictive approach to managing projects and have just completed your cost baseline. Next, you begin working on determining funding requirements. Which of the following is true? Funding requirements are derived from the activity costs. Management reserves are the difference between the funding requirements and the cost baseline. The management reserve is released in a lump sum at the beginning of the project. Funding requirements are an output of the estimated cost process. Which statement is correct? Now, what do we mean by funding requirements? What's another word for funding requirements? The budget, right? The project budget. Basically, the project budget is the funding requirements, is the amount of money that you need to fund your project. So when we say funding requirements, we mean the budget, okay? So is the budget derived from the cost only? Is the management reserve the difference between the budget and cost baseline? Is the management reserve released in a lump sum at the beginning of the project? Are funding requirements, or is the budget output of estimate cost process? What's the right answer? Yes, if you look at it, yes, the management reserve is the difference between the budget and the cost baseline, right? We have the cost baseline. This is the cost baseline, plus the management reserve, and you have the budget. So basically the budget, the cost baseline, and the difference is the management reserve. Is that correct? Other statements are not correct. Excellent. Grant hesitantly knocks on his project sponsor's door to notify her of a budget overage that has occurred. Because of a vendor error, he shared that a critical piece of equipment would cost $30,000 more than originally estimated. Fortunately for Grant, the sponsor understood the situation and approved the use of funds set aside for unexpected events. From where will Grant pull the funds to cover the equipment? Management reserve, contingency reserve, funding limit reconciliation, cost baseline. Where do we get the money from? From which reserve? From the reserve that is allocated to the known risks or to the unknown risks? Of course, in this case, to the unknown risks, right? To the unknown unknowns, which are what? What kind of reserve is this? Yes, this is the management reserve. Excellent. You are in the planning stage of the projects and have just begun to generate the cost baseline. In what activity are you engaged as a project manager? Okay, so you have just begun to develop the cost baseline. Are you in performing the plan cost management process, performing the estimate cost process, performing the determine budget process, or performing the control cost process? When we develop the cost baseline, this is part of what? Of which process? Is it part of the cost management plan? No, because the cost management plan is who and how we manage cost. This does not include developing the cost baseline. Is it in the estimate cost? No, because estimate cost is only estimating the activity costs, only at this level, at the level of the work packages, but the cost baseline is higher than that. So basically it's what? Yes, this is when you do to determine the budget. So it's in the determine budget process, because you determine the cost baseline and you add on top of it the management reserve. It's not, of course, also the control cost process. Okay. Yes. So sometimes you need, to analyze it, analyze the question, and look carefully at the, the keywords of it in order to come up with the best answer again, the best, the most accurate answer. Okay. Mandatory dependency is also known by what other name? We explained types of dependencies, right? Mandatory, preferred, external, internal. Another name for mandatory dependency: preferred logic, hard logic, soft logic, external dependency. What was the other name of mandatory dependency? Yes, it was the hard logic. So you cannot change it. It's hard. It's not soft or preferred logic. Soft and preferred logic refer to the same thing. Okay. Hard logic is mandatory dependency. Okay. Great. Which of the following scheduling method does Kanban use? Kanban. What kind of scheduling methods use? Critical path method, critical chain method, iterative scheduling, on-demand scheduling. What did we call the scheduling that we do while using Kanban? It's called what? Yes, it's called on-demand scheduling. Yes, correct. Great. Ronaldo has just joined the company as a project manager and is taken over an active project that is in the process of developing the schedule. The previous project manager did a good job of maintaining project management documents up to date. Which project management document can Ronaldo reference that will outline the methodology and tools the team is using to perform schedule network analysis? Where can Ronaldo find this information? In the cost management plan, in the activity list, in the schedule management plan, in the project schedule network diagram. What does Ronaldo need to know? Ronaldo is looking for what? He's looking for the methodology and tools. So who and how, right? Yes. So this is what? Schedule management plan. Excellent. Yes. Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, let's move on now to the last individual and specific plan, subsidiary plan in the project, which is procurement, planning procurement. So basically what we will be discussing here is the following. Make or buy decisions. These are probably some of the most important decisions that you need to make in the project. What are the actions that we will do ourselves, that our team will be doing? And what are the actions or activities that we will outsource or that we will contract? Okay, so we will buy from contractors. Okay, so this is important, right? We need to decide on which activities we will be doing ourselves, which activities we will be contracting or buying, right, from service providers or sellers, and how to select those sellers or contractors. So what are the criteria for source selection? And what kind of contracts can we use when we contract those sellers? And eventually, of course, how to develop the procurement management plan and what's included in the procurement management plan. So basically, it's not unusual to go beyond the organization and look for contractors that can be included in the project team that we can contract for short-term basis and help us again or support us in developing or in implementing the project work. It's actually something that we use frequently, and it helps us focus on the core competencies, on the things that we do best. You know, and this is really a general rule all the time. Even you as an individual, you should focus on what you do best, what no other person does like you, because you do this best. Maybe you are the best in designing material. Maybe you are the best in delivering speeches. Maybe you are the best in developing schedules. Maybe you are the best in developing a mobile application, in programming, in testing. Focus on what you do best and let others focus on what they do best. Give the things that you find other people who can do better than you, give them those things. This is the general rule. Focus on your strengths, on your core competencies, right? So for this reason, we need to, set the right procurement strategy. Procurement is, of course, the acquisition of goods and or services. We can procure goods like computers, like cables, like tables, whatever, and we can procure services. We can contract or bring in a seller to help us with a certain work that we probably don't have an experience with, okay? So we can do both. We can look for vendors, suppliers, sellers, contractors, all have the same meaning, okay? For us, all these words have the same meaning. Seller, contractor, vendor, supplier, all have the same meaning. We contract them in order for them to come and support us in the project. And for that reason, we do a make or buy analysis. So we gather data about project requirements, we analyze them against alternatives, and we decide whether we can do this job internally or it's better for us to contract someone to do it. And as mentioned before, when we were discussing risk response plans, when you contract actually someone to do a job, you're transferring the risk of doing this job to them. So this is a risk transfer strategy, okay? So make or buy decisions are decisions made regarding the external purchase or internal, whether we will do it ourselves or whether we will contract it. And we should take the following into consideration. What is the impact on quality, cost, and time? If we do it, how would the quality look like? What would be the cost? What would be the time that we need to do it? And if we contract someone to do it, what would be the quality like? What would be the cost? What would be the time? So we need to consider these factors, right? Is there an ongoing need for specific skill set? If we will need those skills permanently, then we should probably develop the skills internally, because we need to maintain those skills internally within the team, since we will need those skills permanently. But if we will need the skills only for a short period of time, then better we contract someone to do, or someone with these skills. How steep is the learning curve? If I want to train my team to do this, how long would this take them? Because there's a learning curve. They need to, develop the skills to do that kind of work. So this will take some time. There's a learning curve. Now, I need to check also the learning curve. Will it take so much time for the team to develop those skills or not? Are required resources readily available within the organization, or do I need, for instance, to contract them, to hire them, to recruit them? Then again, I need to consider recruitment process and recruitment options. Okay, so these are the things that you should take into consideration when you do a make or buy analysis. Okay. Now, if you have decided to buy certain things, So basically to contract someone or to contract a company to come and do some job, then you need to give them the statement of work or the scope of work, SOW, so they can give you an offer about it, right? So the SOW or the statement of work or scope of work is basically a part of the scope, of the whole scope, of the project scope. So basically we'll take a part of the whole scope, which is the job that we want to assign to the contractor, and we describe it in details in a document that we call the SOW, the statement of work, and we hand it to the suppliers, or we declare it in a request for a proposal, for instance, in RFP, so that the suppliers can bid on it, right? So they understand what is the required job. They need to understand it thoroughly, probably, and then based on their understanding of the required job, they can submit their proposals, their technical proposals, their financial proposals, and so on. So procurement SOW should be developed and will serve as basis to provide procurement documents during the solicitation or the selection process. Okay, and of course the SOW comes as a part from the scope-based plan. Okay, in addition to that, and since we are contracting a company or buying a service from a company, we need also to develop a contract change control system, because it can be there's a possibility, you know, of that we need to change something in the job and in the statement of work that we have developed. So certain things might need to be changed. So we can suggest some changes, and the contractor themselves as well can suggest some changes. So there should be a system that controls those changes and how to, you know, how to process those changes, and who takes decision about those changes. So, and if there's a dispute, for instance, so what is the dispute resolution process? What are the approval levels to authorize the changes, and so on. This contract change control system can either be an independent change control system for each contract, or it can be a system that is integrated with the whole change management system in the project. Because remember, we also have a change management plan, right, in the project, indicating how we deal with changes, how to process changes in the project. So it can be a part of this whole change control system in the project, or it can be an independent contract change control system for each contract that we do with each supplier. Okay. Now, what are the most important source selection criteria? If you want to select, if you get now different proposals from different sellers or from different contractors, what are the most important source selection criteria that you might want to consider? Those are some of the most important criteria that you should consider when you select a seller. Overall or life cycle cost, and by this we mean not only the direct cost, you know, because the contractor might do something cheap for you, but it needs a large cost of maintenance or of operation, you know. They can deliver something of low quality, for instance, for very cheap price, but then when they leave, when the contract finishes and they take their money and leave, you find out that the thing that they have developed or that they have delivered to you needs a lot of maintenance cost because the quality is bad. So when you consider the cost, you don't only consider the direct cost that you will pay for the seller, but you also consider the maintenance and operation cost of the product that the seller will deliver to you. Okay, so the overall or life cycle cost, we call it. Another criteria for considering the supplier is understanding of need. Does the seller understand our need in the project and can probably advise us of the best alternatives of doing the required job. Does the seller have the technical capability? Does the seller use the right management approach? Does the seller, for instance, speak the same management language that we use? If we ask the seller to develop a WBS, a schedule, a risk register, does the seller or can the seller use the same approach as we are using? The warranty, what kind of warranty is the seller providing for their job? The financial capacity, does the seller have the financial ability to fund the job that needs to be done? Production capacity and interest. The business size can be also a criteria, and the type. Sometimes I look for, sellers that are big companies with very well reputation. And sometimes it's not important to me. Past performance of the seller, so can they provide references, for instance, for past projects, and we go and check those references. So references again. Intellectual property rights, do they respect intellectual property rights? Do they use, for instance, authorized softwares in their job? Do they respect the intellectual property of others? And property rights, do they also respect the property rights of, if they are going to use our, our facility, our equipment, and so on? So do they provide, some kind of insurance to the property rights? So all of these can be source selection criteria that we should consider when selecting the right seller or the right contractor. Now, most of the time, especially when we have a long history of working with contractors or sellers, we develop qualified vendors list, which are vendors approved to deliver products, services, or results based on requirements. And this can be created based on historical information. Based on our experience with them in previous projects, we develop this list of qualified vendors that we can contact whenever we have a required job. Okay. We can also use for that market research to help us identify those qualified vendors and add them to our contact list, so we can contact them whenever we have a job that needs to be done. So this is, for instance, an example of a qualified vendor list. You have the vendors, company 1, company 2, company 3, the industry that they work in, computer networking hardware, for instance, capacity 100 to 500 machines, 1,000 any quantity, staff working with the company, reputation, references that can be contacted, and so on. So with this list available at your hand, you can directly contact those sellers and ask them to submit their proposals. Okay. Now, of course, since it's a procurement, we need to develop a contract, right? A contract is a mutual binding agreement. It binds both of the parties. It obligates the seller to provide the specified project or service or result, and obligates the buyer to pay for it. Okay. Now, probably you have noticed that when we don't mention otherwise, we consider ourselves the buyers. So we are looking to contract someone. Okay. So, and this is also right. This is also correct for the PMP exam questions. If you are in the exam and you get a question about the procurement, you all the time assume that you are the buyer. Okay. You are the buyer, you are buying the service, and you're looking for a contractor or seller. Seller, supplier, as we mentioned, contractor, all of the same meaning. Contractor, vendor, all means the same. Okay. So if the question mentions nothing, we are the buyers, and we're looking for sellers, suppliers, and so on. But sometimes the question, comes the other way around, tells you that you are the seller and you're looking to do something. Then in this case, you assume that you are the seller, okay? But otherwise, you assume all the time that you are the buyer, okay? So again, the contract is a mutual binding agreement that obligates the seller to provide the specific project or service or result and obligates the buyer to pay for it. The contract should be customized for each agreement based on what are you buying. Contract types that we will discuss in a minute can be categorized in 3 categories: fixed price contracts, cost reimbursable contracts, or we call them cost plus as well, and time and material contracts. Okay. Now, what are the most important components of the contract that you need to make sure that they exist? Of course, first, description of the work being procured, its deliverables, the scope of the contract, the statement of work, all of the same meaning. The delivery date or other schedule information should be included in the contract. Identification of authority where applicable. So what is the authority that the contract is subject to? Responsibilities of both parties. Management of technical and business aspects. So who manages and how we manage the technical and business aspects. Price and payment terms. Provisions for termination. Conditions that if take place, the contract will be terminated, and applicable guarantees, bonds, warranties. Okay, so these are the main components of any contract that you need to make sure to include when you develop your contract. Let's discuss now the contract types that you might want to use when you procure a company. Now, again, these are 3 categories. Category 1 is fixed price contracts. So basically, when we contract a company, we agree to pay them a fixed price or a lump sum price, okay? And this actually is the safest contract for the buyer. It doesn't include risk because I know I need to allocate this money to this job. So I have a certain amount of money that I can allocate. There is no risk in that. But for the seller, for the contractor, this means risk because, if the raw materials go higher, then who will assume the risk? Who will be subject to the risk? The buyer or the seller? The seller, of course, because we agreed with the seller on a fixed price. So we will not, compensate them for any rise in the raw materials, right? So basically the fixed price is safe for the buyer, but not safe for the seller, okay? The fixed price contracts are usually used when you have high degree of uncertainty, or a clear scope. So if you have a clear scope of work, then you use a fixed price contract. So you need to deliver this job or these deliverables, very clear scope of work for this fixed price, okay? But what happens if the scope is not clear? And we're not sure about the cost of the project, the cost of the raw materials, the cost of the equipment, the cost the contractor will pay. So then, in this case, it's better to use another type of contract, which is the cost plus or cost reimbursable, where we will compensate. So the buyer will compensate the seller for their actual cost plus a fee that will represent the seller's profit. Okay, so basically the seller will submit their invoices of the cost that they have incurred, and we will compensate them with the cost that they have incurred plus something that we agree on. And there are certain types that we will discuss in this category of cost plus contracts, okay? And again, this is what you use when the scope is not clear, the parameters are not clear, we are not clear how many raw materials we will need in the project, what kind of equipment we will need in the project, and so on. Then it's better for us and for the seller to protect ourselves from the cost risk again, to agree on a cost plus contract. Okay, so again, the fixed price contract. In fixed price contracts, the cost risk or the seller basically is subject to the cost risk. In cost reimbursable, there's a balance in the cost risk between the buyer and the seller. The other category is time and material, where we will pay for the seller based on the time that they spend on the project. So an hourly rate, for instance, or a man day, for instance. So basically, we will provide them with the material that they will need, and we will pay them an hourly rate or a man day. And of course, to make sure that this sum will not exceed a certain amount, we need to include a not to exceed limit. So basically, I will pay you, for instance, 1,000 riyal per day. For every day that you spend in the project, I will pay you 1,000 riyal or dollar, but not to exceed, the total should not exceed, for instance, 100,000 riyal. So we set a limit. Otherwise, the seller might try, to extend all the time, because when they extend the time, they get more money, right? So basically, we need to set a limit for that. And this is the kind of contracts that we use in agile approaches. Again, because we cannot develop a clear statement of work. Requirements are changing, customers change their opinion all the time, and so on. So it's better to contract the seller based on time and material. Okay, so these are the main three categories of contracts that you can use in the project. But these have also, types within them. So basically, the fixed price contracts, for instance, you have three types of those contracts. The fixed price. All of them are based on fixed price, but you have, variety of them. The first is firm fixed price. So basically here, the seller and the buyer agree on a firm fixed price that will never change, will not change. You deliver this service or you deliver this job and you take this amount of money and that's it, okay? Another type is fixed price incentive fee. So this is again a fixed price contract, but in order to motivate the seller to achieve a certain objective, we add an incentive clause in this contract. So for instance, if you finish this job before next December, then you will be entitled to a $10,000 incentive. Okay, so there's an incentive that motivates the contractor to achieve certain targets or certain objectives that we would like them to achieve. Okay. Another type is the fixed price with economic price adjustments. And this is used especially when the contract duration is long. When the contract duration, for instance, can span multiple years. In this case, we expect, because of the inflation, we expect raw materials to get higher over the years, right? So in this case, and to protect the seller from the cost risk, we add a clause in this contract that we agree to compensate the seller for the increase in prices. Okay, so we'll compensate them for the increase, for instance, in the raw material prices or the equipment prices that they are using or whatever. Okay, so just to make sure that, again, it's a win-win situation. All the time you're looking for a win-win relationship, and a win-win situation between the seller, the buyer and the seller. Okay, so this type of contract again will protect the seller from the cost risk. Okay, so these are the types of the fixed price contracts. Let's discuss now the different types of the cost reimbursable or the cost plus contracts. First, you have the cost plus fixed fee contract. So this is basically where we agree with the seller to pay them the cost that they incur in the project plus a fixed amount of money. That, for instance, can be estimated as a percentage at the beginning of the project and cannot be changed later. Okay. There's another type that is not mentioned here of cost plus contracts, which is cost plus percent of cost. Okay, we call it cost plus percent of cost, CPPC. Now, this is not mentioned here because you shouldn't use it actually. This is a risky type of contracts. Why we shouldn't be using it? Because in this type of contracts, you are basically motivating the seller to increase the cost, right? Because whenever the cost increases, the seller gets more money as their profit, since it's a percentage of the cost. Okay, and of course, we don't want that. We actually want the other way around. We actually want to motivate the seller to reduce the cost. Is that correct or no? So basically, this is a type that you should not be using. You use either cost plus fixed fee, fixed money that we will pay upon completion of the job, or what if we want to motivate the seller to reduce the risk? How can we do that? We can do that with this type of contract, which is cost plus incentive fee. So we will put an incentive for the seller to motivate them to reduce the cost. Now, how do we do that? Is by agreeing with the seller on a target price. Let's, for instance, assume that after negotiation and discussion with the supplier or with the seller, we agree to set a target cost for the job that they will be delivering. Let's assume that we set a target of $100,000. So this is the target price. Okay. Now the seller is entitled to get all of this cost. Or if the seller can find ways, alternatives to reduce the cost and, for instance, deliver the required job, of course, with the quality requirements that we set, for instance, for $80,000, then the seller has saved us $20,000 US, right? And then we agree to split this saving. So basically, we split the saving, let's say by a certain percentage, let's say by 50-50 or 70-30 or whatever we agree on with the seller, okay? So basically here, you are motivating the seller to reduce the cost, of course, while maintaining quality requirements, okay? So whenever they find ways to save more cost, they will get more profit. Is that correct? But for instance, if they exceed the target price, then again, we will split the difference. So for instance, if the target of the cost reached 120, then this additional 20 will also be split with the same percentage between the seller and the buyer, okay? So this is a cost plus incentive fee to motivate the seller to find ways or alternatives to save us the cost, okay? The other type is cost plus award fee, which is something similar to the cost plus incentive fee, but here, instead of incentive, we assign an award for the seller. And this award is based on subjective, actually, criteria that the seller can, that the seller only can decide on. And based on this criteria, the seller is awarded a certain amount, either the whole award or part of the award, based on the subjective, again, criteria that the seller sets for the contract. Okay, so these are the three types of the cost plus or cost reimbursable contracts. Okay, any question? Now again, for the cost risk, this is something important that you need to understand. Sometimes it shows up in the exam. So basically, again, the buyer and the seller. Okay, the safest contract for the buyer is the fixed price, as we mentioned. The cost risk here is completely carried by the seller when we agree on a fixed price. Okay. The other way around, the worst contract for the buyer is the cost plus percentage of cost that we have mentioned that you should not be using, right? On the other side, of course, it's the best contract for the seller, because whenever the cost increases, they will get more profit. Okay, and then you have this variation. You see that time and material balances between the seller and the buyer in terms of cost risk. Also the cost reimbursable. Of course, the cost plus incentive fee is also a balance or creates a balance between the buyer and seller in the cost risk, as well as the cost plus fixed fee, cost plus fee, and the worst is, of course, the cost plus percentage of cost. Okay. Now, of course, in order to develop the contract, you need to negotiate. So we have a negotiation strategy for the exact parameters that you want to include in the contract. And the project manager and the project teams might be engaged in the negotiation, but actually most of the time it's the procurement department and the procurement manager who are responsible for negotiation and for the final decisions on the contract. Okay. But again, the project manager and team can participate in this negotiation. Negotiations, again, aim at reaching an agreement, and the agreement should include statement of work or major deliverables, schedule with milestones and dates, performance reporting expectations. So what are the reports that the seller should be preparing for us, and when should they send those reports? Pricing and payment terms, inspections that we will be doing to inspect the seller's work, quality requirements, acceptance criteria that the sellers should meet, warranty and future support, incentives, penalties, insurance and performance bonds, subcontractor approvals. If they want to subcontract someone, sometimes you contract someone and they need to contract another party, so it's a subcontract. So in this case, for instance, they need to take approval from us in order to do so. Terms and conditions, change request handling, so again, the change control system, and termination clauses and dispute resolution. If there's a dispute, how we resolve these disputes. Okay. So basically, the agreement objective is to identify and set clear deliverables in traditional projects and clear acceptance criteria. While in agile projects, we don't have a clear scope, and the scope is or can be changed at any time. So basically, we discuss definition of done, DOD. Okay, for user stories that the customer is requesting, or for instance, that we are requesting from the seller, then for each user story, we discuss definition of done. Okay, for the project, for the release, for the iteration, and for the user stories. We need to discuss all of these when we contract sellers to develop products in agile approaches. We also negotiate a service level agreement. If the seller is providing a service to us, then we should discuss the level of service that is expected from the seller to deliver to us. The service level agreement can include statement objective, scope of services to be covered. Let's, for instance, assume that we need an internet service because we are working in a remote location where there is no internet. So basically, we need a seller that comes and set up a satellite connection in this remote location. So we need this service. We need then to agree on the service level agreement, which includes, again, the scope, the service provider responsibilities, the customer responsibilities, the performance metrics. For instance, the response time, the resolution time. If we have an issue with the internet, it should be resolved within 1 hour. For instance, the service should be up and running 99.9% of the time. We set those conditions and penalties for not, for achieving those objectives or for breaching the contract. Okay, so we call this the service level agreement, and it's considered attached to the contract. Okay, we might also discuss a go live blackout time. Now, this is when the development of the product is finished and we need to implement the product at the client side. Then we need a certain time to implement this product, right? This time we call it the blackout time. Why? Because no changes are accepted at this time. So if the customer needs something new or needs to add new requirements, we cannot. It's blocked. It's blacked out time until we implement the product and you operate the product. Now, maybe in the next iteration, you want to ask us to do new requirements, it's okay. But in this transition period, when we finish developing, a product in a certain, sprint or iteration, and we want to implement it at the client side, here we negotiate like 1 week, there will be a 1 week blackout time. So you cannot submit any new requirements in this week since we are implementing the product. Okay, so we negotiate this as well. We call it go live blackout times. Okay, and by this we can develop the procurement management plan, again the who and how. So again, it's a component of the project or program management plan that describes how the project team will acquire goods. What are the buy and make decisions? So what are the things that we will do internally, and what are the things that we will buy? What are the goods or services that we will be buying outside from the performing organization? What are the types of contracts that we will be using? What's the process of obtaining and evaluating bids? What are the source criteria, for instance, that we will use to select the sellers? Mandates. Also, the standardized procurement documents. Are you going to use, for instance, an RFP, request for proposal, or RFI, request for information, where you only request information from the company about their history, about their profile, and so on, just to know about them more. It's called RFI, request for information, or request for quotation, RFQ, where I only need a quotation, or RFP, request for proposal, where I need both a technical proposal and a financial proposal. Okay, so you decide on which standardized procurement document you want to use and how multiple providers will be managed. So how are we going to manage the several, for instance, suppliers? If you have several suppliers in the project and you need to make sure that their work is well coordinated, then how are you going to do that? So all of these are or can be described in the procurement management plan. Okay, any questions so far? So with this, we conclude the procurement management plan, which was the last individual procurement, individual subsidiary management plan in the project. Just again to remind you, although we have mentioned it earlier, there might be also other plans as well, integration plans, such as the compliance management plan. We discussed that before, but here is a more detailed look at how a compliance management plan would look like. So basically, again, in so many projects, you need to meet certain compliance requirements. So you start by identifying those requirements, whether they are legal, regulatory requirements, internal requirements, internal policies that you need to make sure that you are meeting. Okay, so these requirements should be identified, tracked, managed. Again, like specific practices, privacy laws, handling of sensitive information, like corrupt policies, process risks, workplace health and safety, quality requirements, environmental risk, social responsibility. All of these can be sources of requirements, of compliance requirements that we need to satisfy. If you don't satisfy these requirements, then there's a risk on the project, right? If you don't satisfy the compliance requirements, for instance, for the health and safety of your project team, then the Ministry of, I don't know, of Health might audit you and might find out that you are not meeting the health and safety requirements, and they might decide to stop the project work, right? So you put yourself at risk when you don't satisfy the compliance requirements. So basically, you need to identify those compliance requirements, classify them, for instance, in different categories in order to manage them easier, and identify what new vulnerabilities or risks we might be subject to. Changes in legal and regulatory might also be a source of threats that you need to identify. Errors in testing and validation as well, errors or bugs in deliverables, lack of awareness of compliance requirements. All of these can be sources of threats that the project can be at if you decide to neglect those compliance requirements. So all of this actually should be identified, classified, and you should develop a compliance management plan where you document those goals and those requirements. Compliance can be with appropriate government regulations, with corporate policies, internal policies, with product and project quality, with project risks. And components can include the classification and determination of how to comply, and analyze or analysis of the consequences of non-compliance, and the necessary approach or actions, and roles and responsibilities. For instance, I can assign roles and responsibilities for certain project team members in order to follow up and track those compliance requirements. Okay. And only 5 minutes and we conclude this. So basically now we have developed all possible subsidiary plans that we might need in the project management plan, right? But what you need to make sure now of is that all these plans are well integrated and there is no conflict or no contradiction between each and all of these plans. So basically you need to make sure that all of these plans are well integrated. And then when you have this fully integrated project management plan and completed project management plan, then you submit it to the top management and you get it approved, probably after a few discussions. And then when it is approved, it's considered what? It's considered the baseline, that which is the approved version of the project management plan that will be used to execute the project activities and to monitor the project progress. Okay, so basically there's the integration management where we need to make sure that the plans are built, maintained, and executed in well integration throughout the project. So the project manager and others must assess and coordinate all plans and activities. And we have a holistic integrated view ties the plans together, and all plans don't have any conflict or gaps or contradiction. So if we find any, then we need to resolve, and we have a consolidation of the plan, okay, and the intended value that we need to create. And by this, when we approve the plan, it's considered a baseline that we will use for executing and for monitoring and controlling and measuring progress and measuring performance. And these baselines, of course, might be subject to changes, because we might discover later on that some of the plans were not realistic, so we might need to update them. So baselines can be updated, but through formal change requests, of course, in traditional approaches. In agile approaches, we don't have baselines. As you know, we don't have baselines because we welcome changes at any points where changes are being discussed. In order to better maintain the project management plan and track the execution of the project management plan, it is highly recommended, of course, that we use a project management information system, which has the tools and techniques that can be used to gather, integrate, and disseminate the outputs of the project management processes, such as Microsoft Project, Oracle Primavera, and so on. The project management information system is considered an enterprise environmental factor. It enables quick and efficient scheduling, like you saw in the Microsoft project when we gave an example of it. And it helps you, again, tracking and measuring the performance throughout the project life cycle. In Agile, when the project is big and you need to integrate Agile teams working on different aspects of the project, then you can create what we call Scrum of Scrums, because as a rule in the Scrum, we mentioned that the team cannot exceed 9 persons. You remember that, right? But if you have a big project that requires 100 person working in the project, what do? You do basically Scrum of Scrums. So you create, for instance, 10 teams. In each team, there are 9 persons, right? And you do a Scrum of Scrums, okay? Linking those teams together. Or there are also other approaches like the SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework, okay? This is only for you to know. We don't need to, to discuss the details of the Scrum of Scrums or SAFe. And by this, we conclude the planning aspect of the project life cycle, which took us the longest time in this course. In the next week, and the final week, inshallah, of this course, we will discuss managing the project, which includes executing, monitoring, and controlling the project, and of course, closing the project. Any question, ladies, gentlemen? Excellent. Okay, thank you again. Thank you for attending, for dedicating the time to attend, and looking forward to continue with this course next week, inshallah. Have a nice weekend, have a nice evening as well, and stay safe, take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.